Welcome back, everyone. Before we dive in, make sure you drop your thoughts and the lessons you took from this story in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's get into it. My name is Khalil. I am 32 years old. And up until a month ago, I thought my life was on a very predictable track. I work in finance at a firm in downtown Chicago, make around $140,000 a year, and I have always been the sensible, planning for the future type. My fiancée, Danica, is 29, a marketing coordinator at a mid-sized company who earns around $55,000. We have been together for 4 years, engaged for 6 months. Our wedding was planned for next spring, deposits paid, family excited, group chats buzzing with color schemes and seating charts. On paper, everything looked solid. We split our shared expenses proportionally to our income. We talked about a future house, kids someday, vacations when we could afford them. I thought we were aligned, or at least close enough that anything we disagreed on we could work through. I was wrong. 3 weeks before everything blew up, we went to a dinner party at Danica's friend Tiffany's house. Tiffany and her husband, Reggie, live in a new build in a nice suburb just outside Chicago, the kind of neighborhood with wide streets, fresh landscaping, and matching mailboxes. When we pulled up, I noticed a brand new BMW X5 parked in the driveway, gleaming under the porch lights like it had been placed there for a commercial shoot. Danica actually gasped when she saw it. She said, "Oh my goodness, that has to be theirs," and she grabbed my arm like she needed help standing up from the sight. Inside, everything was warm and curated and Instagram ready. Tiffany was already talking about the car before we even took our coats off. She said, "Reggie surprised me last week. I thought we were just going to dinner, and he drove right to the dealership. I almost fainted." Reggie laughed in that relaxed way of someone who knows everyone in the room is impressed. Danica went outside with Tiffany to see the car, while I stayed in the kitchen with Reggie, helping him finish the steaks. Through the window, I could see Danica walking around the BMW slowly, taking photos, leaning into the driver's seat, her smile bright and fixed. Every few minutes she called out, "Tiff, this is crazy. I cannot believe he bought this for you, just because." Over dinner, the car never really left the conversation. Tiffany talked about the features, the sound system, how smooth the ride was, how she felt taken care of. Danica ate it up. She kept saying, "That is real love." Just because. Reggie mentioned his job in passing, senior manager at a tech company, and hinted that he had gotten a substantial raise. At one point, Danica looked at me and said, "See, some men just know how to make their wives feel special," then smiled like it was a joke. But her eyes told me she was keeping score. I tried to let it roll off. People show off at dinner parties. It happens. On the drive home, the car was quiet first. The street lights flashed across her face in the passenger seat as we headed back toward the city. I was thinking about the conversation we had had a week earlier about saving aggressively for a house down payment and building our emergency fund. Out of nowhere, Danica broke the silence. She said, "Why cannot you be more like Reggie?" And her voice was too calm for how sharp the words were. I glanced over, confused. She kept going. She said, "He just bought Tiffany a BMW for no reason. Just because he loves her. He did not need an anniversary, or a birthday, or anything. He just did it. That is the kind of partner I thought I was going to marry." I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. I said, "We have talked about our financial goals. We agreed the house comes first." She said, "Other people can do both. You act like buying a car and saving money at the same time is impossible. Reggie manages just fine." I said, "He makes more than I do from what he said. That matters." She rolled her eyes and stared out the window. She said, "So work harder. Get promoted. Other men provide for their wives properly." That word, properly, hit like a slap. It sounded like I was failing a test I did not know I was taking. I did not respond for the rest of the drive. I just drove us home, listening to the turn signal click and the hum of the tires on the highway. When we got to my condo, she went straight to bed without saying goodnight. The next morning, she was cold and distant while she got ready for work. I made coffee. She took hers without looking at me and said, "I am heading out," like I was a roommate who had forgotten to pay the cable bill. I told myself she was just caught up in the excitement of the BMW and that it would pass. It did not pass. For the next week, the comparisons became a theme. Danica would be scrolling on her phone and suddenly say, "Tiffany and Reggie are in Miami this weekend." He surprised her with a trip. That is what I mean when I talk about feeling cherished. Another evening, when we went out to dinner at a nice restaurant, the bill came, and I slid my card toward the edge of the table out of habit, so we could split it proportionally like always. She frowned and whispered, "Reggie would never let Tiffany pay on a night like this." When I did not answer, she added, "Sometimes I feel like I am dating an accountant instead of a man who actually wants to spoil his future wife." I kept my temper in check, because we were deep into wedding planning. There were days when she was sweet and excited, talking about centerpieces and our first dance song. And then there were days when she seemed fixated on what other couples were doing and what I was not. I told myself it was stress. I told myself she had grown up watching romantic movies where grand gestures were the measure of love. I did not want to start a major fight in the months before our wedding. So I swallowed my irritation and focused on my spreadsheets, my savings plan, and the belief that once we were married, things would settle. The turning point came 2 weeks later at a coffee shop. We were meeting another couple we were friends with, Alana and her husband Jerome. Halfway through the conversation, Jerome mentioned, almost casually, that he and Alana had a prenuptial agreement. He was telling a story about how they had handled a big job change and said, thankfully, the prenuptial agreement covered that scenario, so we knew exactly what belonged to whom. Danica laughed immediately, a sharp, dismissive laugh that made Alana shift in her seat. Danica said, "Who even does that anymore? It is so unromantic. I cannot imagine handing my future spouse paperwork like they are a business partner." Jerome shrugged. He said, "It protected both of us. It is actually one of the smartest decisions we made. It forced us to talk honestly about money before we walked down the aisle." Alana nodded and said, "Sometimes romance is making sure no one ends up ruined if things go wrong." Danica waved her hand and said, "I could never. It feels like planning for divorce before we were even married." The comment stuck in my head. On the way home, she repeated a version of it, saying, "If you ever handed me a prenuptial agreement, I swear I would walk out. That is just how I am built." I did not argue, but my mind was working. Something about the contrast between her glorification of Reggie and Tiffany's life and her disdain for prenuptial agreements fell off, like a puzzle with one piece hidden under the table. The next day at work, during my lunch break, I scrolled through my messages until I found Reggie's number. We had traded numbers a while back after a game night. I stared at the screen for a minute before typing, "Hey man, random question. Do you and Tiffany have a prenuptial agreement?" He responded within minutes. He said, "Yeah, we do. A solid one. My financial advisor insisted before I even bought the ring." "Why?" I sat there for a second, feeling something click into place, then typed, "My fiancé keeps comparing me to you. Thought I would match your energy." He replied, "Exactly. Good luck with that conversation." I leaned back in my chair and thought about it. The man who bought the luxury vehicle, planned the surprise trips, and paid for designer handbags had also insisted on legal protection for his assets before he ever got down on one knee. Danica had never mentioned that part when she held him up as the model husband. She had only talked about the car, the vacations, the gifts. The protection that made that lifestyle possible was invisible to her, or at least conveniently omitted. A few days later, on Sunday evening, we were sitting at my dining table having dinner. I had cooked like I usually did on Sundays. Halfway through the meal, she set her fork down and said, "I was thinking, after the wedding, maybe I could get a nicer car. My Honda is getting old. Something more substantial, you know? Like a BMW. Not necessarily the same one Tiffany has, but something in that lane." Her eyes lit up a little as she spoke, a hopeful sparkle that told me she thought this was the moment I would finally agree to step up. I chewed slowly, wiped my mouth, and nodded. I said, "Sure. That is a good point." She smiled, relaxing as if a tension inside her finally loosened. She said, "Exactly. See, you do understand what I have been saying. I am not asking for something crazy. I am asking to feel like my person wants to give me nice things when he can." I said, "If we're doing things like that, I should probably be more like Reggie in all ways, right?" She tilted her head. She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, he is clearly financially smart and successful. If I am going to model myself after him, I should follow his approach completely." She smiled, thinking she had finally won. She said, "I am glad you are finally understanding what I have been saying. It is not about the car. It is about feeling prioritized." I nodded again. I said, "Absolutely. Which is why I'm going to do what he did." I'm going to start with a prenuptial agreement, just like he has. Her smile vanished so fast it was almost comical. She stared at me, mouth slightly open. She said, "What?" I repeated calmly. "I found out Reggie has a prenuptial agreement. If you want to be more like him, it makes sense to follow his whole model. So, I'm going to get one drafted." She pushed her chair back from the table, her eyes wide. She said, "A prenuptial agreement? Like him?" "No, absolutely not." I said, "You keep saying I should be more like him. I am taking your advice. All of it." She shook her head quickly. She said, "That is different." I asked how. She said, "It just is. A prenuptial agreement is cold and calculating. It means you do not trust me." I said, "It has nothing to do with trust. It is smart financial planning. You said it yourself. He is the model husband. He did it. Why should I not?" She stood up, hands trembling. She said, "I cannot believe you would even suggest that. After 4 years together, after everything, this is what you think of me." I stayed seated. I said, "I think we should protect both of us. Like he protected both of them. That is what you wanted, right? For me to be more like him." She stared at me for another second, her jaw tight, then grabbed her bag and walked out. She went straight to her mother's house. An hour later, I got a text that said, "We need to talk about this. You are being unreasonable." I stared at that message for a long time and then set my phone down. I was tired of feeling like I was being graded against someone else's husband on a curve I had never agreed to. Tuesday morning, I called a family law attorney whose name a colleague had given me. When I explained my situation over the phone, she let out a short laugh and said, "So she wants the lifestyle, but not the protection that funds it." I said, "Exactly." She said, "You are not the first person to walk into my office with that problem. Come in Thursday, and we will draft something fair." Her name was Ms. Porter. She sounded sharp and calm, the kind of person who stays steady when everyone else is emotional. On Thursday afternoon, I sat across from Ms. Porter in a glass-walled office overlooking the city. I laid out my finances. The condo I owned before I met Danica, worth around $320,000. My retirement accounts totaling about $180,000. My investment accounts holding around $95,000. She listened, asked questions, took notes. Then she drafted a prenuptial agreement that was, honestly, more generous than I had expected. It protected my premarital assets, my retirement accounts, my investments, and my condo. It kept our premarital debts separate. It laid out a clear structure for how we would handle income and savings during the marriage. It included a clause about lifestyle maintenance if we divorced before 10 years. And after 10 years, it became more equitable in terms of spousal support. Nothing in it was cruel or vindictive. It was simply organized, careful, and clear. Ms. Porter walked me through each section patiently. She said, "If she signs this, she will be protected from any debt you bring in, and you'll be protected from hers. If you divorce after a few years, she still receives some support based on the length of the marriage. After a long marriage, things are divided more evenly. This is very standard." When we were done, she said, "This will cost you about $2,500 for the draft and consultation." I signed her engagement letter, paid, and left with the document in an envelope. It felt thick in my hand, heavier than the number of pages inside. Friday evening, Danica texted, "Can we please talk? I miss you." I told her she could come over. She showed up with takeout from my favorite Thai place, another one of her apology love languages. She walked in like nothing had happened, kissed me on the cheek, and started talking about her day at work. She described a campaign she was frustrated with, joked about a coworker, smiled in the familiar way that used to make me forget everything else. It was almost convincing, the way she ignored the elephant in the room. We ate on the couch. She scooted closer, put her head on my shoulder, and said softly, "I do not want us to be weird. I was just emotional the other night." I let her talk. After we finished eating, I stood up, went to my desk, and picked up the envelope Miss Porter had given me. I returned to the couch, sat down, and placed it on the coffee table between us. I said, "So I took your advice and went ahead and matched Reggie's energy." She frowned. She said, "What do you mean?" I slid the envelope a little closer to her. I said, "Here is the prenuptial agreement." Her face went pale. She stared at the envelope as if it might explode. She whispered, "You actually hired a lawyer?" I said, "Yes. You said I should be more like him. He has one. Now I do too." She did not open it. She just kept looking at it like it was something toxic. She said, "I cannot believe you are serious about this." I said, "I am dead serious. It is fair. It protects both of us. Your lawyer can review it." She said, "My lawyer? You expect me to hire a lawyer for this?" I said, "Ms. Porter said you should have independent counsel review it. That is how it works. It is about fairness and clarity." She stood up suddenly and left the envelope on the table. She said, "I need to think about this." Then she walked out. This time, I did not chase her down the hall or call her after she left. I sat on my couch, looking at the unopened envelope, and realized I was done playing along with a narrative where I was always the one trying to catch up to someone else's standard while she ignored the parts that did not fit her fantasy. The next morning, my phone started ringing repeatedly. First it was her mother, Valerie, then her sister, Sierra, then her best friend, Brittany. All of them left voicemails in varying tones of outrage. Valerie's voicemail was the longest and the most dramatic. She said, "You should be ashamed of yourself. My daughter is a catch. She could have anyone she wants. You are lucky she even said yes to your proposal. This prenuptial agreement nonsense is disrespectful and cruel. Call me immediately." I forwarded that voicemail to Ms. Porter. She replied via email, "Document everything." This kind of pressure is exactly why these documents exist. On Sunday, Danica showed up at my condo with her mother and her sister. I let them in because I wanted to see exactly how far this would go. Valerie walked in first, her face set, her shoulders squared like she was marching into court. Sierra hovered behind her, arms crossed tightly. Danica looked tired and angry, but under that I saw something else, something like fear. Valerie did not waste time. She said, "We need to discuss this prenuptial agreement situation. It is completely unacceptable." I said, "Actually, it is completely standard for people who have assets to protect." Sierra scoffed. She said, "Assets? What assets? You're not rich. This is insulting." I said, "I have a condo worth about $320,000. I have retirement accounts totaling about $180,000. I have investments worth around $95,000. That is roughly $595,000 in assets I had before this relationship. The prenuptial agreement protects that. That seems reasonable to me." Valerie folded her arms and said, "Marriage is about sharing everything. You are supposed to build a life together, not keep score." I said, "All right, so let us talk about Reggie then. The one with the BMW. He has a prenuptial agreement that protects his assets. Danica never had a problem with that. She actually praised him for it. So why is it different when I do the same thing?" The room went very quiet. Danica shifted on the couch, avoiding my eyes. Finally, she said, "That is different." I asked, "Different how?" She said, "He makes more than you. He has more to protect. It is not the same situation." I said, "By that logic, the more you have to protect, the more you need a prenuptial agreement. Yet you held him up as the perfect husband. You cannot have it both ways. Either it is smart when he does it, or it is insulting when anyone does it. Which is it?" Sierra tried a new angle. She said, "You are basically saying you do not trust her. That is the message here. You do not think she would stick around if you lost everything." I said, "I am saying I am being financially smart, like the man she told me to emulate. If it is wise when he does it, it is wise when I do it. The logic does not change based on who is holding the pen." Valerie sighed dramatically. She said, "If you loved her, you would not need this. Love is about faith and commitment, not paperwork." I said, "If she loved me, she would not spend weeks comparing me to other men and demanding that I change while refusing to accept the full reality of how those men actually operate. That is what started this, not me." That comment landed harder than anything else I'd said. Danica looked like she had been slapped. They left a few minutes later, Valerie muttering under her breath about ungrateful men and modern relationships. Danica shot me a look on the way out that was a mix of hurt and fury. Monday, I got a call from Tiffany. She said, "So, Reggie told me about your text. He also said Danica is really upset about this prenuptial agreement thing. I just want to say, maybe do not tell her about our agreement. It is complicated." I said, "Too late. I already did." And she spent weeks comparing me to Reggie without mentioning that you had legal paperwork in place. That seems relevant. Tiffany hesitated, then said, "Look, The prenuptial agreement is different for us. Our families come from money. It made sense. I said, I worked hard for what I have. It makes sense for me, too. Why should I risk it? She had no good answer. The call ended awkwardly. Tuesday afternoon, Danica arrived at my condo with a lawyer in tow. He introduced himself as Mr. Green and handed me a business card that looked like it had not changed since the 1990s. He appeared to be in his mid-50s, with the look of a man who handled traffic tickets, small claims, and the occasional messy landlord dispute. They sat on my couch. Mr. Green pulled out the prenuptial agreement Ms. Porter had drafted and adjusted his glasses. He said, I have reviewed this document. It is quite comprehensive. I said, Ms. Porter is thorough. He nodded and said, perhaps a bit too thorough. My client feels it is overreaching. I asked in what way. He flipped through several pages, frowning. He said, the lifestyle clause, the asset protection, the debt separation, it is all very protective of your interests. I said, that is the point of a prenuptial agreement. But it also protects Danica from my debts and from any financial risks I might take in the future. It cuts both ways. He said, she feels it leaves her vulnerable. I asked how. She keeps everything she brings in. Her debts remain hers. Her assets remain hers. If we divorce, she receives fair compensation based on the length of the marriage. What exactly is unfair about that? Mr. Green shifted in his seat. He said, the compensation schedule could be considered modest for someone giving up her career growth to support a family. I said, we have never had any conversations about her quitting her job. In fact, she has always said she wants to advance in her field. If that changes, we could revise the agreement. But it does not make sense to pretend she is giving up a career she never planned to give up. Danica finally spoke up. She said, the issue is that I am supposed to be your wife, not some employee with a termination package. I should not have to sign documents that outline what I am worth if you decide you are done with me. I said, you are the one who wanted me to be more like Reggie. He protected himself. I am protecting myself. You wanted this. She said, I wanted you to be generous and successful, not paranoid. There is a difference. Mr. Green raised his hands like a referee. He said, perhaps we can negotiate some terms, make this more equitable and more in line with my client's expectations. I said, it is already equitable. Both of us keep our premarital assets. Both of us keep our separate debts. Both of us benefit from a clear financial structure. If she does not like those terms, she is free not to sign. I'm not forcing her. The room went quiet. Danica's eyes filled with tears. She stood up and said, this is ridiculous. You are choosing money over me. I said, you are choosing an image of a lifestyle over reality. I'm not changing my mind. They left. Mr. Green looked like he knew he was on the wrong side of a bad argument, but was stuck there because Danica was paying him. I emailed Ms. Porter immediately after and summarized the meeting. She wrote back, do not sign anything they put in front of you without me reviewing it. And do not let them pressure you into changing terms that are fair. Wednesday, I got a call from Danica's father, Harold. He and I had always gotten along well. He is quiet, practical, the kind of man who fixes things around the house instead of paying someone. When I answered, he said, son, what is going on with this prenuptial agreement business? I took a breath and explained everything. I told him about the dinner at Tiffany and Reggie's house, the BMW, the comparisons, the ride home where she told me to work harder and be more like Reggie, the weeks of being measured against another man, the conversation at the coffee shop about prenuptial agreements, and how I had eventually learned that Reggie had one. I explained that I had met with Ms. Porter, had a fair document drafted, and presented it to Danica. I told him about the visit from Valerie and Sierra, the arguments, the pressure, the fact that I was simply asking for what his daughter had praised in someone else. He listened without interrupting. Finally, he said, so let me get this straight. She spent weeks telling you to be more like Reggie. You found out he has a prenuptial agreement. You got a prenuptial agreement. Now she is mad. I said, exactly. There was a long pause. Then he said, that is pretty foolish on her part. He hesitated and corrected himself. He said, my daughter is being foolish. She cannot demand that you copy someone and then get angry when you actually do it. Give me a day to talk to her. The next day, Danica called. She said, Daddy talked to me. He helped me understand some things. I am willing to discuss compromises. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop near the park, neutral territory. When I arrived, she was already there with a notebook open in front of her, pages covered in handwriting. She looked up as I approached and gave me a small, tight smile. She said, "Thank you for coming. I thought a lot about everything. I know the prenuptial agreement is not going away, but we need changes." I sat down and said, "What changes?" She slid the notebook across the table. I read her list. My jaw actually dropped. She wanted the lifestyle clause removed so that if we divorced early, I would still pay her as if we had been married more than 10 years. She wanted her $45,000 in student loans paid off by me before the wedding as a gesture of good faith, and she wanted a clause guaranteeing she would receive a $50,000 or more vehicle within the first year of marriage. I looked up slowly. I said, "Are you serious?" She said, "These are my terms if you want me to sign the prenuptial agreement." She said it calmly, as if we were negotiating a contract for a marketing campaign instead of planning a life together. I shook my head. I said, "Your terms? This is not a negotiation where you get all the benefits of protection, but none of the responsibilities. You are asking for all the upside and none of the downside. That is not how this works." She said, "I deserve security. If I am going to sign something that could limit what I get in a divorce, I need to know I am taken care of." I said, "You have security. You keep your job, your earnings, your own assets. What you are asking for is access to my assets with no real commitment besides saying I do. You are trying to turn this prenuptial agreement into a shopping list." Her eyes flashed. She said, "So we have a problem." I said, "We sure do." I closed the notebook, slid it back to her, and stood up. She said, "You're just going to walk out?" I said yes, because this has nothing to do with protecting both of us anymore. You are showing me exactly who you are when you do not get your way. Then I left the coffee shop, my heart pounding, but my mind strangely clear. Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated in ways I had not anticipated. The family pressure campaign intensified. Her uncle Leonard, a man I had met maybe 3 times at holiday dinners, called me one evening. He said, "You are tearing this family apart with your selfishness." I asked, "How so?" He said, "The prenuptial agreement. You are treating Danica like a gold digger." I said, "I am treating her like someone who spent weeks telling me to be more like a man who has the exact same document." I got what she said she wanted me to emulate. He said, "You are being difficult on purpose." I said, "I am being consistent." "That is different." He hung up without saying goodbye. Then her grandmother Evelyn called. She is one of the few members of her family I genuinely like, usually gentle and thoughtful. She said, "Sweetheart, why are you being so stubborn about this paperwork?" I said, "Grandma, she spent weeks comparing me to a man who has this paperwork." I followed her example. Now she is angry that I listened. That seems backwards. Evelyn sighed. She said, "She is upset." I said, "She is upset that I took her advice seriously. That feels like a problem she has to solve, not me." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Then she said softly, "I cannot argue with that." The phone call slowed down, but the in-person confrontations did not. One Tuesday, my office's front desk called and said, "There is someone here asking for you." I went downstairs and found Danica's brother, Leon, waiting in the lobby, arms folded, jaw clenched. He said, "We need to talk." I let him outside, so he would not cause a scene in the building. He said, "This thing with my sister, the whole prenuptial agreement mess, you are being unreasonable. You are making her jump through hoops like she is applying for a job." I said, "Your sister told me to be more like Reggie. I found out he has a prenuptial agreement. I got one. That is the entire story." He stepped closer, his voice rising. He said, "The unreasonable part is how you are making her feel like she is not worthy of trust. She feels like you are planning your exit strategy." I said, "I am asking her to sign a document that protects both of us. She could have had the same protection for her assets if she had any significant ones. She does not, which is kind of the point. She has student debt and minimal assets. That is just the reality. The prenuptial agreement keeps her debt from becoming mine and my debt from becoming hers. It is fair." He narrowed his eyes. He said, "You are calling my sister poor?" I said, "I am describing facts. Numbers on paper. That is all." He shook his head and walked away, muttering, "You are a piece of work." I notified our building security, so they would have a record of the incident. On Wednesday, I received an email from our wedding venue in Milwaukee. Danica had contacted them asking about postponing the date. Since I was the one who had paid the $6,500 deposit, they wanted my confirmation. I called them back. The coordinator sounded nervous. She said, "Your fiancée called about rescheduling. She mentioned you two are having some issues." I said, "We are having a disagreement about financial planning. The wedding is still on as far as I am concerned. If she wants it postponed or canceled, she needs to talk to me first, not go behind my back to vendors." The coordinator said, "Understood. We will make a note that any changes need your consent as well." Thursday evening, I arrived home to find Danica sitting on my couch with our wedding binder in her lap. She still had a key. Her eyes were red, and there were tissues on the coffee table. She said, "We need to fix this. The wedding is in 6 months. Invitations go out next month. We cannot keep doing this." I sat in the armchair across from her, leaving deliberate space between us. I said, "I agree. So sign the prenuptial agreement." She said, "I cannot sign it as written. It is too one-sided." I said, "It protects both of us equally. You just do not like that you do not gain access to my assets while keeping yours separate. That feels unfair to you." She put the binder down and leaned forward. She said, "I am not a financial risk, Khalil. I am your future wife." I said, "Then sign the prenuptial agreement and prove it. If you are not after my money, you have nothing to worry about." Tears rolled down her cheeks. She said, "Why are you being so cold about this? This is not the man I fell in love with." I said, "The man you fell in love with did not have to listen to weeks of comparisons to a man who makes more money. That changed things. You changed things when you decided our relationship was a competition I was losing." She sniffed, wiped her eyes, and tried a different angle. She said, "What if we compromise? I will sign a prenuptial agreement, but you pay off my student loans first. Then I know you are willing to invest in me, not just protect yourself." I said, "No." She blinked. She said, "Just like that?" "No." I said, "Just like that. Your student loans are your debt from before we met. The prenuptial agreement specifically protects both of us from each other's premarital debts. I am not paying $45,000 to make you more comfortable signing a document that protects us equally. That makes no sense." She stared at me. She said, "You are really going to let our relationship end over this?" I said, "I'm not ending it. You are. You can sign the prenuptial agreement and we get married, or you can refuse to sign and we do not. That is your decision." She looked at me for a long moment, then stood up, collected her binder, and walked out without another word. When the door closed behind her, the condo felt strangely calm. Friday morning, Mr. Green called me directly. It was a bold move. He said, "Mr. Owens, we need to discuss your position. I'm trying to avoid unnecessary legal costs for both parties." I said, "You can discuss anything you need to say with Ms. Porter. That is why I hired her." He said, "I am simply trying to speak man to man. Your fiancée has legitimate concerns." I said, "My fiancée wants me to pay off her debt and buy her a luxury vehicle within a year, while signing away my right to protect the assets I built before we even met. Those are not legitimate concerns. That is greed." He said, "That is defamatory. My client is not greedy." I said, "She wrote down her demands in her own handwriting and handed them to me. I kept the list. If you would like a copy, I am happy to send you a scan." There was a long silence on the line. Then he said, "I will speak with my client." I said, "You do that." Then I hung up and forwarded the conversation summary to Ms. Porter. She replied, "You are doing exactly what you should. Stay firm." That afternoon, Brittany texted me. She wrote, "You are really going to lose Danica over a piece of paper?" I replied, "If a piece of paper that protects both of us is more important to her than our entire relationship, maybe we should not get married." She responded, "That is not what I meant." I wrote back, "That is exactly what you meant. She can sign it or not. That is her call." Then I added, "Ask Tiffany how their prenuptial agreement is working out for them." Brittany never replied. Saturday, Danica arrived with both of her parents for what they called a family meeting. I let them in because by then, I wanted to see how far they would push. Harold looked uncomfortable, avoiding my eyes. Valerie looked ready for battle. She said, "We have prepared a counter-proposal." I raised an eyebrow. I said, "A counter-proposal to a prenuptial agreement? That just means you want to negotiate the prenuptial agreement. Tell your attorney to send it to Ms. Porter. Valerie said, "We are trying to avoid more legal fees. We can handle this as a family." She slid a stack of papers toward me. I read them, and my disbelief turned slowly into something like dark amusement. They did not want a prenuptial agreement at all. Instead, they wanted a marital agreement that gave Danica access to all marital assets, including my premarital condo, if we lived in it as our primary residence. It required me to maintain certain lifestyle standards, including a luxury vehicle for her at all times. It obligated me to pay off her student loans within the first year of marriage and contribute $75,000 to a family planning fund for future children. In exchange, I received nothing. No protection of my premarital assets. No limits on her spending. No safeguards at all. I set the papers down and asked, "This is a joke, right?" Harold said, "We are trying to find middle ground." I said, "Middle ground? This gives her everything and gives me nothing. This is worse than having no prenuptial agreement at all. At least without one, I would not be agreeing to specific obligations on top of everything else." Valerie snapped, "You are being selfish. Marriage is about sharing." I said, "Marriage is about partnership. This proposal turns me into a wallet, not a partner." "The answer is no." Valerie folded her arms. She said, "Then there will not be a wedding." I said, "If that is Danica's choice, I will respect it. But I am not signing away almost $600,000 in assets and committing to another $75,000 in spending for someone who will not sign a basic prenuptial agreement to protect us both." Harold stood up slowly and said, "Let us go. This is not working." Danica lingered at the door. She looked at me, eyes glistening, and said, "This is really it? You are choosing money over us." I said, "You are choosing access to money over us. Do not twist it." She held my gaze for a second, then left. After they were gone, I sat on the couch with their counter-proposal in front of me and realized something that settled over me like a quiet truth. The prenuptial agreement had not caused these problems. It had simply exposed them. Everything that followed, the pressure, the demands, the attempts to renegotiate reality, had been there, just not visible. Now it was all written down, itemized, and undeniable. Over the next week, Danica stopped contacting me entirely. No calls, no texts, no emails. The silence was sharp at first, then slowly dulled into something that felt like acceptance. On the 5th day, I called the venue and told them we needed to cancel the wedding. The coordinator sounded genuinely sympathetic. She said, "The deposit is non-refundable." I said, "I know. At least we will not owe the remaining $18,500. She said, "I am sorry it worked out this way." I thanked her and hung up. I spent the rest of the day calling the caterer, the photographer, the disc jockey, and the florist. Most deposits were gone. Total damage came to around $9,200. It hurt, but I kept reminding myself that it was cheaper than marrying someone who saw my life's work as something she was entitled to claim without limits. That night, I sat on my balcony, looking out at the city lights, and felt strangely lighter than I had in weeks. On day 5 of our silence, Tiffany called again. She said, "So, Reggie told me everything. About you asking him about our prenuptial agreement, about how this whole thing started with the comparisons, everything." I said, "Okay." She took a breath and continued, "I feel partly responsible. I should have shut down the way she kept bringing us up. I did not know she was using us like a measuring stick." I said, "She made her own choices." The comparison started the conversation, but her reaction to the prenuptial agreement is what finished it. Tiffany said, "For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. Our prenuptial agreement actually saved us during a rough patch last year. It protected both of us." I asked what happened. She hesitated, then said, "I wanted to leave. I was overwhelmed, burned out, and I felt like marriage was another expectation I was failing. It is a long story, but the prenuptial agreement meant I could have left cleanly and fairly. We would not have had lawyers tearing each other apart. Knowing that weirdly made me feel safe enough to stay and work on things. The protection made me feel like I was choosing him, not trapped with him." I said, "That makes a lot of sense." She said, "Danica knows that part too. She just never tells that version." 8 days after I canceled the wedding, Harold called again. He said, "Can we talk? Just us. Off the record." We met at a quiet bar on the south side, a place with worn leather booths and jazz playing softly in the background. He looked tired. He ordered a beer. I ordered one too. After a few sips, he said, "I need to apologize. My wife has been pushing our daughter toward this materialistic mindset for years. The designer bags, the luxury car expectations, the constant comparisons to other couples. It is all Valerie's influence." I said, "And yours?" He winced and said, "I stayed quiet when I should have spoken up. I try to keep the peace. That is on me." He continued, "You calling out the prenuptial agreement double standard needed to happen. My daughter needs a reality check. She thinks love means never having to hear no. That is not real life." I asked, "Is she getting that reality check now?" He shook his head. He said, "Not yet. She has doubled down. She keeps saying she will find someone who will give her everything with no questions asked, no conditions, no paperwork. Maybe she will, but it will not be someone who worked as hard as you did to build something. Most men with real assets protect themselves." I nodded. We sat for a while in comfortable silence. After a bit, I said, "What about the wedding? What does she want to tell people?" Harold sighed. He said, "She wants to cancel it and blame you for being controlling with the prenuptial agreement. She is already telling some of her friends that." I said, "She can say whatever she wants. I already canceled the vendors. I lost about $9,000 in deposits, but it is done." Harold winced. He said, "That is rough." "I am sorry." I said, "It is cheaper than a divorce in 5 years when she gets restless and decides she deserves half of everything I built before we even met." He nodded slowly. When we finished our drinks, he insisted on paying. It was a small gesture, but I appreciated it. On day 12, Ms. Porter forwarded me a formal letter from Mr. Green. Danica was demanding to keep the engagement ring, claiming it was an unconditional gift. She did not want to return it. She wanted to keep it as compensation, in her words, for emotional distress. Ms. Porter drafted a response explaining that in our state, engagement rings are considered conditional gifts, the condition being marriage. No marriage, no ring. She attached case law. They threatened to sue. She sent more case law. After a few more exchanges, they went quiet. Day 14, I changed my locks. Danica still had a key, and I was done giving her access to my home. The locksmith came in the morning. By noon, everything was new. It cost me $240. That evening, as if on cue, she showed up and tried her key. When it did not work, she knocked hard. When I did not answer, she pounded on the door. Then my phone buzzed with a notification from the door camera. I answered through the speaker. She said, "Did you change the locks?" "Are you kidding me?" I said, "Yes. The wedding is off. There is no reason for you to have access to my place." She said, "I have stuff in there." I said, "No, you do not. I packed everything that belonged to you 2 weeks ago. It is in labeled boxes in my garage. I will have it delivered to your mother's house." She said, "You cannot just lock me out." I said, "I can." And I did. Just like you try to lock me out of my own assets. It feels bad, does it not? She screamed a few choice words at the camera and stormed off. I saved the footage and sent a copy to Ms. Porter for my file. On day 16, Mr. Green called Ms. Porter and agreed that the ring would be returned. That afternoon, Danica texted to say she would drop it off. I met her outside my building, in front of the lobby doors. I did not invite her in. She held the ring box in her hand for a moment, staring at it, as if it represented a future that had evaporated in front of her. She said, "Here." Her voice was flat. She handed it over and looked at it one last time like it physically hurt to let go. I took it, slipped it into my pocket, and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. She walked away without looking back. On day 20, I went to a jeweler downtown and sold the ring. I had researched comparable pieces online and knew roughly what to expect. The jeweler studied it under a loupe, weighed it, and opened an offer. I received $11,800 for it, almost enough to cover the deposits I had lost on the wedding. I walked out of the store with a certified check and deposited it into my savings account, the same account Danica had never had access to and never would. Over the next week, mutual friends began reaching out. Some had heard that I had refused to marry without a controlling prenuptial agreement. Others had heard that Danica had refused to sign away her rights. People had chosen their sides based on whatever version of the story reached them first. When they called or texted, I kept my explanation simple. I said, we had very different views on financial planning. It was better to find that out now than later. Most people accepted that and moved on. A few pushed harder. One friend said, come on, man. A prenuptial agreement? That is a lot. For them, I laid out the BMW story and the prenuptial agreement discovery. I said, she spent weeks comparing me to a man who bought his wife a luxury vehicle. She told me to be more like him. When I found out he had a prenuptial agreement and got one myself, she acted like I had committed a crime. That is the whole story. That usually ended the conversation. People either understood or they did not. In the background of all of this, I started seeing a therapist once a week. It was my idea. I wanted to understand how I had missed some of the signs. As I described our 4 years together, the therapist gently pointed out patterns I had ignored. The way Danika's eyes always went to the price tag first when we were shopping. The way she would sigh dramatically when she saw someone else's vacation photos and say, must be nice. The way she had pushed me to upgrade my phone the same month I was trying to max out my retirement contributions. None of those things were fatal by themselves, but together, they painted a picture I had not wanted to see. 30 days after the first serious prenuptial agreement conversation, I received a final text from a number I did not recognize. It was Danika. She wrote, I hope you're happy. You destroyed us over money. I looked at the message for a while. I thought about all the dinners we had shared, the holidays we had spent together, the nights she had fallen asleep on my chest. I thought about the BMW in Tiffany's driveway, the way her voice had hardened when she said, properly, the list she had slid across the table at the coffee shop, demanding debt payoff and a luxury vehicle as a condition of signing. I thought about the ring in my pocket the day she handed it back, about Harold paying for our beers and apologizing for raising a daughter who believed love meant never hearing no. I considered responding. I imagined typing, you destroyed us by refusing to accept the same protection you praised in someone else, or, it was never about money. It was about what your reaction said about your priorities. In the end, I did not write anything. I blocked the number instead. Sometimes silence says more than any carefully crafted paragraph could. A few days later, Reggie reached out. He said, Tiffany told me everything that happened. I just wanted to check in. We met up at a bar near my office, a place where no one knew us. He ordered a beer. I did too. He said, when you texted me asking about our prenuptial agreement, I figured you're just doing research, maybe thinking about it. I did not think you would actually follow through like this. I said, she told me to be more like you. I was just being obedient. He laughed, then shook his head. He said, well, you match my energy exactly, including the part where you protect yourself first. That is smart. I asked, how is your marriage? He took a sip of his drink and thought for a moment. He said, better since we had our own prenuptial agreement conversations last year. We had some rough patches. There were days when one or both of us thought about walking away. But the thing is, the prenuptial agreement forced us to be honest from the beginning. We both know where we stand. We both know what we would walk away with if it came to that. Funny thing is, that clarity makes it easier to stay. There is no guessing, no hidden expectations, just choices. I nodded. He said, what happened with you and Danika is painful, but here's what I see. She wanted access without accountability, security without contribution, benefits without commitment to the hard parts. The prenuptial agreement just put that in writing. I did not argue. He was not wrong. We finished our drinks, talked about work and sports and everything else for a while, and then said goodbye on the sidewalk. As I walked back to my car, the air felt crisp and clean. So that is where I am now. Single at 32, out roughly $9,000 in wedding deposits with a canceled venue contract and a sold engagement ring. But I still have my condo. I still have my retirement accounts. I still have my investments. I still have every dollar of the $595,000 or so in assets that Danika and her family felt entitled to access without any meaningful protection in place. More than that, I have the knowledge that when pressure hit, I did not fold. I did not let guilt or manipulation push me into a decision that would have cost me for decades. The prenuptial agreement did not chase away a good relationship. It revealed that the relationship was built on a foundation I could not trust. It showed me what happened when being more like him was put into practice and the part she did not like legal protection, came along with the part she did. When someone shows you who they are when they do not get what they want, paying attention is not cynicism. is survival. Danica showed me entitlement and a willingness to weaponize her family to get what she wanted. I showed her boundaries and consequences. We are both living with those choices now, just on very different sides of the line. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.